This is ContraZoom,
where we go back and forth about film.
I'm Dakota Arsenault.
And I'm Rachel Ho.
A few weeks ago, the CBC put out a list entitled The 50 Greatest Films Directed by Canadians. It was put together by Peter Kennett, Eleanor Knowles, with original artwork designed by Marie Bergeron. This is actually a subject the show has previously mined, as way back on episode 45, Canadian filmmakers, Sammy Felchenfeld and I talked about our favorite Canadian directors that I'll link to in the show notes. This new CBC list ranges from the first narrative films produced in Canada, like Going Down the Road, to the fully formed Québécois industry heavyweights like The Barbarian Invasions and Crazy, to Indigenous cinema reclaiming space with Beans and Rhymes for Young Ghouls, all the way up to Hollywood mega hits like Terminator and In the Heat of the Night. It is a big show we have today, so that's why there's 4 of us who all participated in voting to discuss the poll. First off, a special shout out to Rachel, who not only voted on the picks like the rest of us here, but also was asked to contribute to the article as she wrote in praise of the number 6 film Crash, directed by David Cronenberg. Joining Rachel and I today is Matthew Simpson, one half of the Awesome Friday podcast, who everyone should know by now is a regular guest, last heard on episode 236, Dr. No at 60 Years, and for the first time, Taylor Beaumont, a writer for the website For Real, where he reviews both new and old movies, and has a regular feature called Best Reels. So welcome back to the show, Matthew, and welcome to the show for the first time, Taylor. How are you guys doing today?
Matthew, I was going to let you jump in there, but I guess I'm the new one, so I'll say I'm doing fantastic. I'm happy to be here.
I, too, am happy to be returning again. You're my favorite show to guest on. So, yeah. Do with that what you will.
Do you guest on many other podcasts, Matthew?
I do, actually. And yours is my favorite. So, take that and run with it, I guess.
And I think that Awesome Friday is probably Rachel's favorite podcast to guest on, considering she does it so much as well.
I also I do not guest on other people's podcasts, though. So really, Matthew.
Oh, see, she's a big get then. So good job to us there, Matthew.
And I enjoy it. I do enjoy talking to Matthew and Simon because, like, Simon and I, we just talk about Jake Gyllenhaal, and it's good. And they let me talk about Elvis all I want, which is really nice.
Excuse me, we do not let you talk about Elvis. I now insist you speak about Elvis.
Yeah, you guys do encourage it, and I appreciate that. I really do appreciate it.
And let's be honest, Rachel is no longer a guest on our show. She's just on the team.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So, like, including, I think you're going to be on our next episode too. So, yeah.
Pending scheduling, I think, isn't it?
Yes, we do need to work out exactly when, but yes.
Nice. And Taylor, I'm shocked it sort of taken this long for me to ask you to come on, because we are in the same Pacific Northwest movie group chat that Matthew is also in. So the three of us routinely talk about movies and stuff like this. And I've had almost everyone from that group on except for you. So I'm feeling really guilty and self-conscious about that right now.
No. Don't feel guilty. Don't beat yourself up. It's all good. I'm just happy to be here now. That's all.
It's kind of rude,
Excellent. Actually.
I'm not going to lie. I don't know why Taylor's taking
Rachel
this long to get on here.
Yeah. I haven't had Taylor Baker yet, so you beat him.
Yep, I'm good with that. Number 1 Taylor still. That's right.
What do you have against the name Taylor, and why are they taking so long to get on the show?
Rachel, It is far too long for this podcast to contain itself. I'll have to explain it all. As I mentioned off the top of the show, we are talking about the CBC list that came out, the 50 greatest films directed by Canadians. If you have not seen that yet, maybe pause the show and have a quick perusal of that first, because I think it's really going to help understanding a lot of our discussion here. And I think one of the first things to kind of really point out is anytime you have a list, especially of something of movies, it's always going to be super subjective. 83 people voted on this list. You've got 4 of them right here on one conversation, so that's not very many, but that makes up some percentage point there. But still, even though we had our own input on how this list was sort of shaped, we probably have our own thoughts and quibbles, and this was ranked too high, this was ranked too low, sort of thing, as any movie list is. And I think that's sort of what's going to be fun today, talking it through a little bit, our thoughts on it, especially since, I think all of us here really appreciate Canadian cinema to varying degrees, but in a way that we want to see it succeed. And so something like this, I think, is a fun conversation to have, because it's about celebrating, quote unquote, good movies, or at least movies we like and we want to represent. But before we get too deep in our conversation, I would love to kind of go around first, say how many of the top 50 films we have seen, and then to the best of our abilities, remember what we voted for. So we were allowed to pick 10 movies. It was supposed to be in order from 1 through 10, and I will go first. I've actually seen 26 of the 50 movies. I've gone on a nice little spurt. In the last 2 weeks, I've watched 6 of the movies that were on the list, so it's been really nice playing catch up with movies I hadn't seen. But in order, first place was Ensemble, second place was Crash, third was Brother, fourth was Arrival, fifth was Crazy, sixth was In the Heat of the Night, seventh was Eastern Promises, eighth was Women Talking, ninth was The Stairs, and 10th was Ashgrove, and 8 of those picks ended up making the final list. Rachel, go to you next about your general overview of the list.
So I've seen 28. Which I thought was quite low, but compared to you, it's I'm doing all right. I'm actually doing all right. Wow. That's okay. Going through the list, I did notice I have a big blind spot for French films, the French Canadian movies. So that's something I need to change. My list, I did not save my list. So I just kind of threw together what I think I put on there, and I don't know the order. My guess is actually, I think I probably put Ensemble as my first one as well. But the ones that I think I remember are Enemy, Ensemble, Crash, Dead Ringers, Ghostbusters, Double Happiness, Terminator 2, Crazy, Rude, and American Psycho. Very, very nice. Okay, Matthew, what about you?
You know, I was worried that I was going to have the lowest number because I've seen, according to my memory, 30.
Nice.
And that is, I mean, over a very long period of time, though. Like in the last, I checked on my Letterboxd in the last 7 years, I've only seen about 14 of them. But I distinctly remember seeing films like Ensembles and a number of other ones from like the 90s when they were new, because I'm old. And I honestly do not remember my list, other than the fact that I'm about 99% sure that I put The Sweet Hereafter at the top. I know Ensembles was on there too, and the Barbarian Invasions was definitely on there. I do remember specifically choosing a more recent French-Canadian film called You Will Remember Me, which I thought was really, really good. And most of my picks were more specifically Canadian films, if that makes sense, compared to the final list. But that's, I think, a topic we'll probably come back to in a little bit.
Yes, we will. Absolutely. And Taylor, what about you?
Well, come on, guys, step it up. As Canadians, let's go. I got 34 out of the 50 I recalled watching. So feeling pretty good about that. But I also don't really recall what I put on my top 10. Full disclosure, I'm pretty sure I approached it from a just best Canadian films period perspective, not best Canadian directors. Canadian directed films. So my results were probably skewing things a bit. But I remember I had Mommy on there, The Sweet Hereafter, Mon Oncle Antoine, Atinarjuat for sure. I think I put Black Christmas on there.
Oh, wow.
That's a great choice.
Thank you. And what else? I think I put The Grizzlies on there as well. But yeah, like again, I think I shoehorned myself more just thinking Canadian films period. So yeah, I'm not the best list bunch here for sure.
No, I think something that's really nice is the fact that comparatively the Canadian film industry is significantly smaller, obviously, than Hollywood and Britain. And, you know, on par with some of the other countries around the world, but, you know, nowhere near one of the top producers, that we have that room still that we can have some really great out there picks like Black Christmas. I saw on Twitter, I can't remember who it was, talking about how they voted for Psycho Gorman. So you get stuff like that where it sort of allows the more unique, weirder, non-conventional stuff to kind of have room to still be voted on, even if some of these movies didn't make the cut, like neither Black Christmas or Psycho Gorman made the cut.
Yeah, I think you got to kind of shout out Canada's, you know, genre film impact that it's had, both for American productions, you know, filming on Canadian soil, and weirdo Canadian productions as well. You know, I was kind of looking through the list and just hoping to see something more in the, you know, the more in the horror genre spectrum. Like no Black Christmas, no My Bloody Valentine, no Ginger Snaps. I don't know, just some ones that kind of have always struck me as just like great Canadian like horror flicks. So
I'd agree with the horror thing because I think Canada is known for a lot of comedic talent coming out of the country, but I think Canada as a country is really great at making some pretty wacky horror movies, and it's a bit of a shame that didn't get more representation on the list. I add to Taylor's list Blood Quantum, which was one that I kind of debated. I remember debating putting it on, whether or not I wanted to put it on, but I actually went with more older films versus newer releases. Blood Quantum, I think, is 2019 or something like that. Not that was like a hamper I put on myself, but it was just, there are other films that have been with me longer. But I would agree. I think that it's a bit of a shame the list doesn't have as many genre movies when I think this country's greatest thing is probably genre film.
Yeah, I mean, you got a good smattering of Cronenberg on there, of course, and I'm sure.
Yeah, but he doesn't count, does he? He's David Cronenberg. Yeah. He's probably the best director that this country has ever produced. So,
I mean, he definitely counts. He's too formative for all of us. I'm not even going to joke about it. Cronenberg definitely counts. And we're saying this, but also like there's a ton of Cronenberg. It's not exactly horror, but there's a bunch of Denis Villeneuve. There's a bunch of like James Cameron, like sci-fi action flicks. Like there's a good smattering of genre stuff in here, but definitely not a lot of the like 80s classic low budget horror that I think in many circles we're known for, which is again a shame.
Yeah, but that kind of just goes back to the idea that this wasn't a list about the 50 greatest Canadian movies. It's about the films that were directed. So actually, Taylor, I meant to ask, after you said that you had done mostly Canadian produced films, like Canadian productions. Did you do
Matthew
that
as well said that too.
And Matthew too, yeah, sorry. Yeah. But did you guys do that on purpose or...
No, I misread the prompt.
Read it wrong. Oh, okay. I wasn't sure like if it was specifically you guys were going for like you wanted to make sure that you put in Canadian produced films. But okay, that's fair.
I definitely misread the prompt, but I will say that if I hadn't misread the prompt, I think I probably still would have favored Canadian film. Like another one that just popped into my head that I 100% put on my list would be like The Red Violin, which I think is a beautiful Canadian film. And I feel like where the list ended up, I don't think is a bad thing, but it's definitely like, it's a lot of American movies. And I do want more... I personally, and again, this is something we'll come back around to, but I would like the list to be a little more Canadian, if that makes sense. You know what I mean?
I suppose, though, that the other way of looking at it is it's looking at how Canadian films Canadian filmmakers have influenced outside of the country. And my assumption is that was kind of the point of the list, was to show the reach that Canadian filmmakers have. Because Canadian films are very Canada only, generally speaking, anyways.
Yeah, and honestly, I 100% agree with you, and I also see that as a very valuable thing. It's just not what I was expecting, I guess would be a better way to put it.
TIFF covers the greatest Canadian list, don't they? They always do that.
If anything, I think that like are clearly different ways of approaching the list making here. Me and Matthew compared to other people who read instructions. I think it kind of points to just how this list was kind of formed, though, because like if you're going through the list, like you got that whiplash of like number 11 T2, and then you got 12 My Winnipeg by Guy Madden, and it's just like
couldn't be more different.
More different films on the list. I think that's great. I mean, I love a list that jumps all over like that and covers so much ground. But for someone maybe the less film knowledgeable CBC reader would know T2 for sure, but then they'd come across My Winnipeg maybe, or one of the later films that you see down the list, like Les Ordres or a film like that, and they might be like, what is this? They might just be taken so far away from what their comfort viewing is. It's interesting, I think.
I think it's really interesting as well that like I think the way the list shook out is, as Rachel was saying, actually quite valuable, because Canadian cinema maybe especially among Canadians, does have a bit of a reputation as maybe not being that great. Like, we definitely have a lot of gems, but we have a lot of like low budget, not so great stuff as well, and none of it gets enough play. But when you see something like like number 10 or number 12, My Winnipeg, next to Terminator, someone with a bit more broader knowledge might be like, how is this next to Terminator? Maybe I should actually check that out. And that might be valuable.
Yeah, that's another side of things. Yeah.
I sort of feel like piggybacking off of that thought is oftentimes if you see publications putting out lists and stuff like that and you start scrolling through it, and you can kind of get a gist of what either perspective or biased people are sometimes coming from, and that's just inherent with everything that happens. We all have our own biases and things like that. But you can start reading a list from a publication, and you know whether they prefer one genre or another, or a certain era, or a filmmaker, or style of acting, or whatever it is that you want to sort of quantify movie list can be compartmentalized under. You can start to scroll through. And you can, I don't want to say you'll be dismissive of it, but you'll be looking at it and maybe some of the lesser known ones, you'll be like, okay, I'm kind of getting the vibe that they're going for. Whereas I sort of appreciate with this list, you're looking at it and, coming back once again to like the T2 next to My Winnipeg. And there's quite a few, very big name directors next to, very, not as well-known directors, and I think you can really appreciate that, like, hey, there's enough variety here and enough different kinds of movies that it's kind of hard to spot maybe where the internal biases are coming from, and sort of appreciate that, oh, like you were saying, if this means someone's going to check out My Winnipeg now that had never heard of it before, that's fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, all for that.
We already started kind of getting a little bit into the positive or negatives of the list, but before we get into that, let's sort of look at the top 10, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So at number 10, we've got Titanic. At number 9, we've got In the Heat of the Night. At 8, we have Crazy. 7 is Dead Ringers. 6 is Crash. And I apologize, there might be a couple movies here I mispronounced. Number 5 is Kanasatke, 270 Years of Resistance. Number 4 is Ensandi. Number 3 is The Sweet Hereafter. Number 2 is Stories We Tell. And first overall is Atanjawat, The Fast Runner. So obviously, with my bad pronunciation aside, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this list. This one is kind of all over the place where, we've got some French films, we've got some English film, we've got some indigenous films, new, old. So it's nice to kind of see where the variety really all shakes out here. Rachel, what were your first thoughts on seeing this top 10 list?
My first thoughts were, wow, I haven't seen enough of these in the top 10, and that's embarrassing. But I actually thought the top 10 shook out pretty nicely. Like, I like that a lot of these are like properly Canadian films, first off, like kind of going off what we were talking about. I think it's funny that Cronenberg took 2 spots, but not surprising in the slightest. And yeah, I like that there's a decent balance. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this later. There could be a better balance, but I think that there's a reason for that. But I kind of like that only really Titanic, I think, is In the Heat of the Night as well. But I like that it's a fairly pure Canadian list, and it does reach across kind of, what they call like the big, nobody calls it this, I'm just calling it the big 3 in Canada, which is like English speaking, French speaking, and then Indigenous as well. And so that's nice that I like that's that kind of shook out that way.
What about you, Matthew?
I basically agree with what Rachel said. I think, for as much as I was saying before how I was expecting it to be more Canadian, I actually really appreciate that the number 1 choice is very unapologetically Canadian, like a very, very specifically Canadian, and Indigenous, because it is a great film. It wasn't my number 1, but like it is a great film, and I think it deserves to be at the top. But I that's my main feeling about the list, about the top 10, though. Like, I think it's otherwise very well put together.
And what about you, Taylor?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said thus far. I love the Canadian representation that you're getting out of this top 10. I've seen all the films but one, and that one is Crazy by Jean-Marc Vallée. So I'm a little disappointed in myself for not having ticked off all 10 there. But this has given me my kick in the pants to go finally watch that, because it's been on my watch list for a while now. as had In the Heat of the Night, which I watched for the first time a couple nights ago. It's fantastic. So I'm happy that this list finally, got me in the right direction there. And yeah, I also rewatched Et un Arjuat recently because it was one of those films that I watched way back, I believe, in a university film class. And it's been a while for me. But yeah, revisiting it was fantastic. It's a pretty stunning film. It's a pretty remarkable film and just everything it accomplishes. And when you take into account just how it had to be accomplished in the Arctic conditions and how it was all done authentically and with the community there, they didn't bring in many talent. It was, it employed the people there. They ate the food there. They ate the food of the region. It was like everything was just this very homegrown production while also just kind of telling this massive, legend that's been passed down throughout that culture for 500 years or something like that. So yeah, it's just fantastic on all those fronts. But just a really compelling story as well, with some really cool set pieces and just really interesting moments and some cinematography that will truly knock you on your back sometimes, even though it is digital. It's really stunning. So yeah, I'm really happy with the top 10, and yeah, like I'm feeling feeling confident with this top 10, just in where the film community's head is at in terms of Canadian directors and stuff.
Yeah, it definitely sort of seems that we kind of understand good art when we see it, and that's one of those things. When the list came out, I had actually not seen 5 of the 10, but like I said, I've been on a crazy spurt the last 2 weeks watching a lot, so I was able to catch up with Dead Ringers, The Sweet Hereafter, and Stories We Tell, and definitely missing out on both of those Indigenous films where I really need to see them. But yeah, I am probably far from a Titanic truther as you can get. I am a anti-Titanic person, however you want to call it. But that said, I still super appreciate the value and the absolute game-changing nature that Cameron brought to the industry by making that movie. And he sort of unfortunately doubled down on what I view the worst aspects of Titanic with his Avatar movies. But that said, he's still one hell of a director, and it takes a certain kind of talent to have the highest grossing film of all time and have that record stand for 20 years and only be beaten by himself, which is a pretty impressive feat. And really, it's a joke at this point when Cameron said he's the king of the world, but he really is the king of Hollywood as far as the legacy goes for creating mass appeal in movies.
I just want to say it's a hot take to say that doubling down on love was a bad thing, but
Yep, that's exactly what I meant. Thank you, Matthew.
I'd say I don't hate Titanic like you do, Dakota. I wasn't a huge fan of it, but maybe it was just how old I was when it came out. Like maybe I just wasn't old enough to really appreciate it. I watched it a few years ago. I think during lockdown, actually. I think I was like, yeah, I'll watch Titanic. And I remember liking it a lot more than I had remembered. But I actually think it's great that it's on this list. Like I think of all of the Hollywood movies that, especially under James Cameron, because I think it's hard to have a conversation about, a list that has the best Canadian directed films, and you don't have James Cameron in the top 10 feels a bit wrong. Personally, I think I would have put T2 in there instead of Titanic, but I can completely understand why Titanic goes in there, because it is just a marvel of filmmaking. Not so much storytelling. I don't think it's like a great example of storytelling necessarily, but I do think in terms of just strict technique and filmmaking, I find it really hard to dislike Titanic in that sense.
I disagree that it's not a well-told. So I will say that the story of Titanic is perhaps basic, but it's not like bad. It's as with Avatar, I think it's an extremely well-told version of exactly what it is. I think that it's full of archetypes and tropes, but they are perfectly executed versions of those things, and I don't think that's a bad thing. And this coming from someone who I never hated. I mean, I probably did hate Titanic, but that's probably because my sister it came out when I was 16. My sister would have been 14, and she had the double VHS and watched it endlessly. And so I just kind of got overexposed to it, in addition to just not really being the target audience at the time. But now that I'm an adult, it's a great movie. It's a great time at the movies. And, it brings a tear to my eye. It's a wonderful little love story in a huge Hollywood blockbuster. And I defend it being 10th. Maybe even it should be higher. There, I said it.
Wow.
I would also put T2 in the 10th slot for the record.
Yeah, honestly, they're both good choices. I would say that if we're talking about the greatest films by Canadian directors, though, Titanic definitely has a much larger cultural footprint than Terminator 2 does.
For sure.
I mean, that kind of goes down to how did we all define what was the greatest? And how did we, because I'm sure some people kind of purposely went to they purposely went to great lengths to diversify their lists as well, and leaving off certain things. So I think it just depends on how we all defined what greatest is. And that's kind of exactly what you started with, Dakota, and talking about a list like this being incredibly subjective, because they didn't give us any guidelines about what we should consider greatest. They didn't give us a criteria or anything like that. They just literally said, give us 10 movies that are, to you, the greatest films directed by Canadians. And that was it. That was the only kind of guidance we were given for our list like this.
Mm-hmm. I also look at this list, and of the top 10, it also kind of breaks into a whole bunch of different categories, which I find pretty interesting. Obviously, in the first and fifth spot, we've got 2 Indigenous films. We've got 2 French films, which maybe we should have more, considering how much more advanced the Quebec's industry is compared to English language Canada. And then we've also got, 2 Cronenberg films, which, as Rachel pointed out, he's probably Canada's greatest director ever made. And then you also got people like Valliere and Villeneuve, who come from this same era of Quebec filmmaking, and then they break into Hollywood and mainstream. And then you've got Norman Jewison, who made In the Heat of the Night, who sort of is, probably the biggest original breakthrough to make it in Hollywood from Canada. And then, of course, James Cameron sort of following in similar footsteps of, making his mark south of the border. And then we've also got 2 documentaries. We've got Stories We Tell in there as well, along with Kanesatake, 270 Years of Resistance, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing them wrong, and I'm so sorry. So yeah, it's kind of nice that there's this really widespread of different types of filmmakers and different types of films being made here. That's the one thing that really jumps out the most to me, I think.
I did love that there's 2 documentaries. I don't know if people were really expecting that documentaries would even make the 50, to be honest, but I like that there were 2, and they are the top 2. They're number 1 and 2, so I find that really funny.
Well, they're 2 and 5.
2 and 5, sorry.
Yes.
I should have this list in front of me, but it's fine.
I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily that surprising. I don't know personally all 83 people, and just let me just say, 83 is a lot fewer than I would have expected, given that I got to vote in this. But I know a lot of film nerds who voted in this, and film nerds like documentaries, so it sort of makes sense to me.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense there. And then there's also, the TIFF top 10 Canadian films of all time. Every approximate decade they've released it. The last one coming in 2015, and 5 of the 10 movies they listed made it into this list, the top 10 as well. So there's no shock about that as well, because you've got Attenerjuat at number 1. Number 3 was The Sweet Hereafter. Number 7, Dead Ringers. 8, Crazy. And 10, Stories We Tell. And almost all of them, I think only one of the movies on the entire list, Lilio, did not make the top 50 list from CBC. So I think that sort of shows the overlap of these are Canadian made, and I believe these are all, they all are Canadian directors as well for the TIFF list. So that I feel like that would sort of maybe look, the list, that's probably how it would look if it was more to the way that the 2 of you voted rather than the way Rachel and I voted.
Right. Yeah, that would make sense.
compiled some other stats as well. So I'm going to, rattle off a couple of them, and I'd love to kind of see where any of these stats sort of jump out for any of you, and we can kind of lead the direction in that way. The two most popular decades featured were the 80s and the 2010s, with 11 movies from each of those decades. And there's maybe a little bit of a recency bias, because if you do the 80s up until today, that's 42 out of the 50 movies. Really shows that they're, not much of a history for us to pull off of. The oldest movie listed is Of Whales, the Moon, and Men, which was from 1963. And then the newest were both Brother and Women Talking, which came last year in 2022. This list is also 66% English and 26% French. And then you have 3 movies that have some combination of English and French alongside Cantonese and Arabic, and one more in Inuktitut. And as far as gender breakdowns go, it is 82% male and 18%, which is 9 movies that were directed by women. I'm going to save some stats about directors that are featured multiple times for later. For us to first kind of break down those stats. Is there anything that really jumps out for you 3 there? Rachel, I'll start with you.
Kind of par for the course, if I'm honest. Nothing there really jumps out at me as being surprising. Actually, that's not true. I suppose the recency bias stuff is kind of interesting, because I think for me, whenever I'm voting on lists like this, there isn't a disadvantage for films that have come out relatively recently, because, like I said, they just don't live with you as long, and they haven't had an opportunity to make a mark on Canadian film or just the film industry at large. And that's not their fault, obviously, but those are the things that, like, later on, maybe in another 10 years, another 20 years, then more films that have come out in the 2000s, the 90s, 2010s, 2020s are going to be on those lists. But I think, I know I heard some people on Twitter kind of not upset, but kind of pointing out the fact that there weren't very many women on the list, that there weren't very many non-white filmmakers on the list. But to me, that kind of gets chalked down to a similar thing of, those opportunities just weren't there for the majority of Canadian film industry for those groups. And so it kind of makes sense that you don't have as big of a pool to draw from, which is unfortunate. But hopefully, again, if they ever do this list again in 20 some odd years, then the list would look very, very different, I'm sure. So I don't think I was too surprised at anything in terms of the statistics of it, because it just kind of makes sense. Like, it makes sense to me the way that people would have voted on a list like this.
What about you, Matthew?
I mean, if anything, I'm sort of with Rachel here that, like, none of it is really truly surprising, but if there is something that's surprising, to me, it's actually that there are as many women as there are. Because there should definitely be more. But given the history of, like, Canadian filmmaking and just filmmaking in general, it's very, the director's seat is very male dominated. And in a list of twice as many films, I would have expected it to be like 9 or 10 women, not 50. So it's surprising to me in a great way that there are as many women as there are, because I was expecting fewer.
And Taylor, what about you?
Yeah, again, just not really super surprised with those stats you kind of rattled off there. I guess I would have liked to have seen a list that acknowledges more French-speaking Canada, because there's been a lot of significant contributions there, especially when we're talking about cinema. So yeah, I mean, that's just a little disappointing to see, but when you open it up to all these big American productions like Titanic and so forth, then I can see how things get pushed to the side for some people. But other than that, I mean, the stats seem pretty par for the course, as was said earlier.
Sorry, Dakota. There's like another tweet I saw that somebody had written, like, all of this list is pretty much Toronto and Montreal. And they're like, you guys know that there are filmmakers outside of Toronto and Montreal, right? I didn't actually, after I saw that, I meant to, like, look at where everybody was based. Because I can imagine, I can see that there might be a skew towards those two cities. But yeah, that made me laugh, because I just thought, I thought Vancouver would have been in there somehow, but apparently not. Apparently to that person, it was a very, very heavy Toronto and Montreal bias.
I mean, looking at this list, yeah, it's tough, because the French films, you kind of categorize them all as being Montreal because, that's unfortunately the city where most of the stuff is going to be. Some of the stuff was filmed in, as far as I'm aware of, the ones I recognize, in parts outside of Montreal, but still in Quebec. But, you still sort of chalk up, if it's a French movie, it's a Montreal thing. As far as the English language movies go, a lot of them are Toronto-based, especially when Cronenberg,
takes up like how many spots
heavily
on the list too. So
yeah, and all of his movies are Toronto by default. So instantly it looks a lot more than that. But then you have all the Hollywood movies, which clearly are not Toronto based, like In the Heat of the Night and Titanic and Terminator and Ghostbusters and American Psycho and stuff like that, and Moonstruck. And
I think they meant like the directors are from Toronto or like they're from Montreal, like that's what they were talking about. Was like
I disagree with that because there's quite a few BC based directors I'm seeing here. There's some from, obviously, Guy Madden is from Manitoba, people like that. Obviously, it does skew more to Southern Ontario and the Montreal area.
Director Alan King was born in Vancouver. He's a Vancouver guy.
There we go. Yeah, nice. and I believe, is Sarah Pauly from? No,
she's from Toronto.
Yeah, she's from Toronto.
Toronto gal. But I think it is just that kind. Again, like we joke, but Cronenberg really did take quite a number of spots on this list, and so he is a very Toronto guy, right? And then Clement Virgo, he took a couple spots too, and he's a Toronto guy. And Denis on the French side, like he took a few spots as well, and he's from Montreal. So like or is he from? I think he's from Montreal or the Montreal area at least. But yeah, that to me, I meant to look it up and actually see if they were correct or if they just kind of noticed a few people and then just went, it's all Toronto and Montreal. I think that's what they meant. I think they meant it was like the filmmakers are from there, not that the movies are based there or made there.
I mean, they are correct. Most of the directors are from Toronto and Montreal, but to me, this actually kind of makes sense just because of the way the Canadian film industry as a whole works. Like, as I'm sure you guys are aware, like much of our infrastructure is taken up by American productions. Like lots of American stuff is shot in Vancouver and Toronto very specifically. But in Vancouver, it's basically 100%. Like it's not 100%, but basically 100% of our infrastructure here is just going to American productions. Whereas I don't think that's necessarily true in Toronto. I think they have a much more, for lack of a better way to say it, I think they have a much more like vibrant culture and a stronger internal culture that allows this kind of thing to happen for directors to break out in Canadian cinema in a way that just there's not really room for it here almost, which is very disappointing and very upsetting, but also, again, not surprising.
I'm sure it helps that Telefilm's offices are here.
100%.
So I'm sure that helps a little bit. And I'm sure the French equivalent is, I think, based out of Montreal as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure Dakota can attest to the fact that, like, most productions here, I mean, you could make an argument that most of the productions in Vancouver aren't just American. They're basically all Hallmark and the CW. Like, it's...
as of late, a lot of it. As someone who has worked for both of those companies. Yeah.
And it used to be like, I have other friends who work in the film industry who've done a lot of work here in Vancouver. And there used to be a lot of other stuff that filmed here, and stuff still films here. But like superhero films all film in Atlanta now, right? But we used to do a bunch of them, like the original, those Fantastic Four movies from the Zeros, they were shot here. The
X-Men movies.
X-Men, like lots of stuff was filmed here. Yeah. That just isn't anymore because of tax incentives in other places. So it's again, like I'm not trying to say this is a good thing. I'm just saying that it's not actually surprising to me.
Other interesting thing is sort of the idea of maybe recency bias or something like that. And I sort of look at this list, and because, before the advent of streaming, it was, you had to go to a movie store to watch your movies if you didn't catch it in theaters. And unfortunately, due to the way retail space works, they only want to carry the popular titles. So a lot of older Canadian, like specifically Canadian cinema, was just really hard to find unless you were watching it in school, which I'm sure a lot of us had watched, whether it's movies these or some of the other movies that receive votes were probably ones that we originally saw in school at some point, whether it was a history class or something else. Or I went to acting school, so I saw like Going Down the Road in film theory class. because we did a unit talking about Canadian cinema. So that was something that I watched then at the time. And I imagine, other types of post-secondary programs would also sometimes have to show Canadian films because it would touch on a subject that they were dealing with. And so it was a way to introduce a narrative concept of it. But before streaming, so many of these movies were next to impossible to find unless you knew exactly what to look for. And even still with streaming today, it's a conversation Rachel and I have had multiple times. It's one I know, Matthew, you and I have had, and I've heard you and Simon having it multiple times, as far as the lack of accessibility of watching Canadian movies. We'll watch something. I remember listening to your show, Matthew, specifically, in your brother review, and Simon was just aghast that this was not the most popular movie of the year because it was such a good film. And he's like, how come this wasn't nominated for the Oscars and all that sort of stuff? And you kind of walked him through the way the Canadian system works a bit more, because he obviously comes more from having experience back home in England, but then also with the American system as well. And it's just so shocking that a lot of these movies most people probably have not heard of because they just don't have the ability to watch them. Luckily, lately, there's been stuff like Crave, and Netflix is finally seemingly picking up the slack a little bit. CBC Gem has a bunch of these movies still, but there's quite a few of these movies where I'm looking at where to find them, and it's like, well, good luck. Maybe check eBay or something like that, or hope that your local rep theater is going to show it. Like that's basically all we have.
Tubi, check Tubi.
Tubi. There's also
Yeah.
I'm not sure how available it is outside of even Quebec, but there's a bunch of the French language ones are on Club Illico, which is like a Quebec streaming service, which is kind of amazing, actually. But if you want to watch Crazy, it's on Club Illico.
I didn't know they had their own streaming service. It's not surprising.
Makes sense.
That's very funny.
But yeah, if you want to watch any of the old like Arcand or like Valet films, like Crazy is on Club Illico. I'm pretty sure like the Invasion of Babert is on there as well. I don't subscribe to it, but like I see it because I'm an affiliate for Just Watch, so I can see where everything is. But it looks like a neat little service as long as you speak French.
Yeah.
You think they have English subtitles on their
Honestly, I think they do.
Oh, that's nice.
I don't actually subscribe, but I'm pretty sure they do.
That'd be good. It'd be also. I do genuinely wonder if you can subscribe outside of Quebec. Because I could see that being not a thing. But I'm going to check it out afterwards and see, because I would 100% subscribe to that if I'm allowed to.
And then, like, to sort of continue the thought of recency bias, where unless you sort of grew up and watched it when it came out, you might have missed it, and that would have been like one of your only shots. Like, I think back to when last year, Rachel, we did our greatest films of all time. And it wasn't shocking that people were putting silent films from the 1910s and the 1920s and movies all throughout the history of cinema. But, we can't name obviously because the infrastructure wasn't really in place, but like there's Nothing Better from 1963. There's only 3 movies from the 60s and 5 from the 70s. Like, where's the preservation going and the accessibility for people to watch these sort of movies from that came out during this time?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that personally, I always think that those kind of things lie with something like a telefilm, because they have basically taken it upon themselves that they're going to run the film industry in Canada. And so if you're going to do that, then you need to do all ends of it. And that includes film preservation, I think. But, I would also say that Canadian film probably didn't really find its groove until the 80s, which is, I think, why, not to discount any of the movies that did come out before then, but I think it was in the 80s when you had the new wave, which included Cronenberg and Clement Virgo and Mina Shum and Patricia Rozema. Patricia Rozema is somebody, actually, I'm surprised any movie of hers didn't show up on this.
I've heard The Mermaid Singing is on the list.
Is it on there?
It is.
Yeah. Oh, it is.
Yeah,
sorry. I just literally scrolled through it now. But yeah, like I think that was when Canadian cinema kind of really came into its own, was probably then. And I mean, maybe you can trace it to a move from telefilm that they started to do, and the National Film Board, actually. I should throw them into there as well. But yeah, like the two of them, it's definitely up to them to preserve those things. And to make things more accessible for us to watch. I know the National Film Board actually does a really great job of putting there's a ton of free films on their website for people to go and watch, and their new ones and some old ones as well. So they do a pretty good job. I'm going to aim my ire more at telefilm.
Yeah, NFB is definitely leading the charge there in terms of preservation and education, and
I'll say you're right. You're not wrong. They have an absolute ton of Canadian stuff on their free streaming service for everyone. But if you're a university student, they have even more. Like if you can access it with student credentials, there's about a bazillion more films. Like Entourage. I can never pronounce it. I'm sorry. The number one movie on this list, Entourage, is on the NFB, but only on the university version, basically. So there's a bunch of films like that too. But again, I'm pretty sure you get access for free as long as you can prove your credentials, or as long as your institution is subscribed.
Yeah. Well, that's it, everyone. Back to school.
Yeah.
In more ways than one.
Yeah, let's keep learning. Absolutely. I think that's, going back to the fun thing. Watching 6 in the last 2 weeks has been a lot of fun playing catch up with this list and looking at the ones I still have to go. It's, once again, going back to this idea of like, we shouldn't be ashamed of movies we haven't seen. We should be excited for the journey that we still have the ability to go on as far as watching a lot of these movies. And because there's so many good movies on this list, and even more that didn't make the cut, as you can tell by when we were talking about our lists, who we thought we voted for, and the ones that didn't make the final cut.
Is there any that people were really disappointed that they didn't see on the list? Like any particular films?
Yeah, I really wanted The Red Violin to be on the list.
Okay.
Because I unabashedly love that film.
I was just going to say, in terms of like Canadian directors, I'm surprised there was no Bruce McDonald on this list. I don't know if there might be some disagreement as to whether he's produced a really super fantastic film, but he's done a lot for Canadian film. And, I wouldn't be upset if I saw something like The Tracy Fragments or Hardcore Logo on this list. I was also surprised to not see 32 short films about Glenn Gould, which I think is a fantastic film. Again, maybe more of a niche pick, but I just think it's does fantastic things with the kind of episodic anthology type film form. And I guess I'm also surprised that other more recent films such as Mandy wasn't on there. That one made a pretty big splash worldwide, I feel. So yeah, those are just ones that just came to mind. But if I thought on this more, I'm sure I could think of many others. But yeah,
I guess I'm kind of surprised that there aren't more films by Don McKellar as well. I know he's on there with Last Night, I think.
Last Night. Mm-hmm.
But I think he's directed a number of films. He's a fairly prolific Canadian. Like, he shows up in a ton of Canadian stuff and he directs a ton of Canadian stuff. I'm kind of surprised there's not more from him on there.
Yeah, I don't know if he's directed a ton, but he's definitely been involved with a ton of projects, either as producer, writer, or all these things. But no, I was surprised as well.
Yeah, as someone who's seen a few of McKellar's movies, I think they got it right with picking his best one, Last Night. His other ones are fine. They're really cute comedies for the most part, but I don't think any of the other ones really live up to what Last Night did, or really, I wouldn't feel comfortable taking off any of the movies that I was familiar with on this list for ones that I've seen of his.
Yeah, and that's fair. He seems for me, I'm just trying to say there was a moment there where he was in everything Canadian, yeah. And I'm kind of surprised he's not more represented on the list as a result.
Yeah,
but you're not wrong. They did definitely pick what I would consider his best film as well. Last Night is great.
I think one name I'm not totally shocked to not see on this list, but still maybe a little surprised. No Paul Gross. Now, granted, his movies aren't great, but he's still a bit of an institution.
Yeah, but his movies aren't good, so
end of conversation.
I will say that as a person who existed through, and I'm sorry, I keep talking like I'm an elder statesman here, but I'm only a couple years older than I think all of you, and having lived through peak gross at a time where it could have been formative, it was not. And I will say I've seen him in a lot of things, and I would say his best performance was in a movie recently called Biba Boys, and that is a terrible movie that he didn't direct. So I am not surprised he's not on the list, and I am furthermore glad that he is not.
I would think if there was one Paul Gross movie that would have maybe made the cut is Men with Brooms. That's probably his best movie. But like stuff like Passchendaele and Hyena Road, there's a reason why it's not on the list, unfortunately.
See, I was going to say, I think if you look at if they made a list of like who are the best Canadian-born directors or like the most influential or the most whatever, then I think maybe then he makes it on there kind of thing versus if he doesn't have a film. Because if you look at like kind of what Dakota was saying about like he's an institution, like he is somebody, again, it depends on how they form the question. But like to me, that's more talking about an individual as a director versus any individual film that he has actually made that's any good. I personally, I wasn't surprised, but I was sad not to see Mina Shum on the list because I really do love Double Happiness. But I know that that's not a very popular film.
I think it's actually a great call out. I'm glad that you voted for it. I've only seen 2 of her movies, and that's one of them, and I quite like it.
There's like a handful of those directors, like I was mentioning in the 80s time, that I shouldn't actually include Cronenberg in that because he came before them, and they kind of, I don't know if I say following Cronenberg's footsteps, but they were all very influenced by Cronenberg. And she's definitely a part of that. Like she's definitely a part of that group. And it's a bit too bad she's not on there. But again, not that surprised that she's not on there because I think not as well known, I would say, as everybody else.
She might actually have the opposite problem as Paul Gross. She's maybe not prolific enough. Like Paul Gross makes a lot of stuff. He's very involved in theater in Canada. And Mina Shum has made, I think, I say I've seen 2 of her films. I think that means I've seen 2/3 of her films. Yeah,
she hasn't made too many. But again, it's not about like for this list in particular, it's not about, the director themselves. It's just about the actual movie.
Yeah.
And I personally think Double Happiness deserves to be on there.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great film.
Yeah, I didn't have any major misses for me, and that is more due to the fact that I just haven't seen enough, I think. If I was to expand my list to, a top 20, I would be repeating a lot of the same directors I voted for already. So, I think as far as notable ones that were missed, I think probably basically the slashers that Taylor was mentioning off the top, stuff like Black Christmas, Ginger Snaps, stuff like that. That probably is the biggest shock because that's pretty well known, not just in Canada. It's well known across the cinephile community as great genre movies. So that would probably be the biggest misses from me, but movies I haven't seen, so I can't really comment on my own opinion on them, and specifically anything else as well.
Ginger Snaps is actually a really surprising one that didn't make it on there because it is a very, very popular movie. And it is, maybe it's just the horror thing because horror does have a hard time getting on lists like this. So that might be it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. The next stat I kind of want to go into is about taking up space. And so as mentioned earlier, probably one of the biggest complaints of this list is that 48% of all of the 50 movies is 6 directors who each have 3 or more movies on the list, headlined by David Cronenberg with 6, Denis Villeneuve with 5, James Cameron with 4, and Denis Arcand, Norman Jewison, and Sarah Polley with 3 films each. Now, if we to expand those numbers to include the 4 directors, Agoyan, Virgo, Vallier, and Brolt, who have 2 films each, that means 10 directors account for 64% of the top 50 list, which is not a lot of variety.
No, but, can you argue that Cronenberg doesn't deserve to have all those spots? Or that Denis doesn't deserve to have all those spots? Like, I actually think it's pretty well... Oh, no, I'm not saying to you specifically. But, like, I'm just saying, I think it's like, to me, it makes sense that they do take up so much space. And because... Canada is a very young country, just generally speaking. It's a very young country. And so the film industry follows that in a way, in that we kind of started a bit late. We started a little later than something like a Hollywood or France, Italy, Japan, or the UK. And so it doesn't surprise me that there is a handful of people who took up the most space because they have been the most impactful. And when you have a director like a David Cronenberg, not, I don't want to say a no-brainer, but actually I'm going to walk that back a little bit. I wasn't expecting that much Cronenberg on the list. I was expecting a decent amount of Cronenberg, but maybe not that many Cronenberg films. But if I like looking at it, I go, yeah, I get, like, it makes sense to me that he would be on there, because you talk to other like younger filmmakers today and you ask them, who's your favorite Canadian filmmaker? Cronenberg will always be there. Cronenberg is like, he is the Canadian film industry in many, many ways, for better or for worse, you know. And I mean, like I said earlier, I think you do this list again in 20 some odd years and Cronenberg is not going to, he'll be on there. He'll be on there probably multiple times, but he won't have 6. That's for sure. I'd
be willing to bet he'd still have the most, though.
I think he'd have the most, but I don't think you would have that clumping. Like, I don't think you would have that, like, that. It's a pretty insane stat to say that 60% belongs to, what'd you say, like 10 directors, something like that? Like, that's pretty, that's nuts. Like, but that's just, you got to give it time. And when eventually the industry becomes bigger, hopefully it becomes bigger and becomes a bit more diversified, then I think that he takes up less space, but he will still take up space because he's David Cronenberg, so he deserves to take up some space.
There was a Canadian director I did see lamenting on Twitter the lack of newer directors being included on this list. I would look at maybe someone like Tracy Deer or Jeff Barnaby as the only 2 newer directors. And even then, I think Tracy Deer is probably the only one that I think has made one film that has made this list, where Barnaby made a few films before his unfortunate passing. I believe it was last year.
No, there's what's her name? Elmaya Tailfeathers as well. Is relatively
oh right
new.
Yes, and she's made a couple documentaries, but I think only one narrative. But yes, she is pretty new as well.
Yeah, but you're not wrong. I think that just goes like sorry, I'm just going to jump in. I think that goes to, like, if this is the list of the greatest Canadian films, then I think that we talked a bit about recency bias before, and I think this is where recency bias would sort of hurt someone, because they haven't really been necessarily around long enough to be the greatest, right? So I sort of get it that, like, even in the top 10, the newest film in the top 10 is from 2012, and that makes sense to me because it's been around long enough that we can be like, you know what, a decade on, this really is one of the best. Whereas something like The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open, which is only like 2018 or 2019, which I think fully deserves its spot on this list. But I think in a decade's time, it might be higher because we'll be able to say that, like, yeah, you know what? This really is one of the best. I don't know. Feel free to disagree.
No. I'm with you. Things need to gestate sometimes, you know, and that's clearly kind of what's happened there with the top 10. I agree. And yeah, I mean, like, some good recent films for sure, but yeah, we need time to sit with things sometimes. And yeah, I think the top 10 really reflects that.
I also think it's going to be when the voter body changes as well, like a younger generation is going to grow up with something different to us. Like the fact that there's things like Terminators and the Ghostbusters and the Titanics, like that's very much so speaking to a very specific generation of moviegoers. And not to say Ghostbusters isn't great and excellent and perfect, but maybe in 20, 30 years, like a younger generation didn't grow up with Ghostbusters in the same way that we did. So I think that might factor in as well.
That's also true. I was also just thinking it might be, and just to be clear, I have absolutely no idea the makeup of the body of people who made ballots for this, but I would love to know what the demographics of that are as well. Like, because if it was mostly dudes, I wouldn't be surprised, right? And if it was mostly white dudes specifically, I still would not be surprised. I'm sure it's not as bad as I'm maybe making it sound like it might be, but that does seem to be the way things go, right? And we're evolving past that, but I don't know that we're there yet. So I would love to know a little more about the demographics of the voting body and how that might change if we do this again in 20 years or whatever, right? Like, it might be I would expect that in 20 years, it would be a far more diverse group of people voting, and hopefully more of them too.
Yeah, that's something I kind of wish they were a little more transparent about this list. They do talk about the methodology on the article itself, where it says 83 people submitted ballots, but unfortunately, for two reasons, I would have liked if they had named names of who voted. One, because selfishly, I'd love to see my name up on a CBC article being thanked. That's neither here nor there. But two, because of what you're saying is what's the makeup of this list? I know, Rachel, you're mocking me. I can hear your laughter. I'm just going to go right through this.
I just want my name on the CBC. I just want to see my name on the CBC website. So they should have listed everybody.
Right.
Spoken like someone whose name is on the CBC website.
I know. Sure, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I know, right? Other than the people who wrote in praise of the different films, so, looking at, say, the number 6 film, Crash, where it says written by Rachel Ho, or the number 7 film, Dead Ringers, written by Norm Wilner, or Crazy, Peter Knecht. Other than breaking down, the top 10 mostly had a different person for each one, but I think there's only 2 people that basically did 11 through 50.
I think it's only one person. I think Rad only did it.
Was it just one?
I'm pretty sure. Okay. I think Rad did 11 through 50. That was a lot for him to do, but yeah, I think he did 11 through 50.
A lot of work, yeah.
And then 1 through 10, I believe, is a different, like 10 different people did 1 through 10.
Yeah, that's the way it looks like it. And it looks like they mostly paired up people with who have been champions for certain films for a while for some of them. So I'm not totally surprised with some of the people that got. If all these people were also voters as well, then you have a bit of an idea of who is voting. But, like I said, I'd love to be able to see the whole breakdown, because I'm also curious about, the French films chosen. There's a couple of the big films, specifically Incendie, Crazy, and Mommy, I think are probably the 3 most well-known French-Canadian films that even us English-language slobs have seen and will vote for. But the other French-language films are, pretty niche and, not ones that you hear talked about a lot. So I'm very curious to know who from French-language cinema was maybe voting on this and helped influence this list, because they got their names out there. I think Arcon is the other easy one to kind of vote for, but there's also some really unique French films on this list.
I don't know this for sure, so I'm not putting words into CBC's mouth here, but my guess would be that they would have made a very concerted effort to make sure that they reached out to Quebec people, so Quebec film people, because it is important. Like, I do think that it was important that they do that, but I think, it would have been nice to see the demographics, though, actually, of all the voters. Like, list everybody's name, so I could see Dakota's name on there. It would have been great, but it would have been nice to see, because my guess is you had to have reached out very, very specifically to, the CBC arm in Quebec and say, like, make sure you guys vote on this. And then they would obviously be more skewed towards the French films, which makes sense.
And maybe because I probably don't follow any French people on Twitter, maybe I do, maybe I just don't know about it, but I didn't really see any uproar from the Canadian film scholars being like Quebec was not properly represented, or they ignored French language cinema, something like that. So I think that's a little interesting that maybe 26%, it's not a lot, especially considering they definitely have way more of a thriving industry than English language side does, but I think that's one of those things where it's like 26%, that's about as we can do when probably most of the people voting for this are English speakers.
I'm kind of surprised how many French films ended up on there, just because I just would have expected it to be more English leaning. Like, obviously it was English leaning, but even more so than it was. So kind of in the same way that Matthew was saying he was surprised that there were more women on the list than I'm in the same exact way more surprised that there are that many French language films on here. Delightfully surprised. Put it
another way to look at that would be that a lot of the English films that are on here are ones that sort of broke big everywhere. But a lot of the films on here that are like very specifically Canadian are French. So I think that might be the way the representation broke down a little bit. That, like, I think probably across everyone's ballots, like, people were like, yeah, James Cameron, and also this Canadian film that I love that happens to be from Quebec, because there was a hot minute there where all the most interesting stuff was coming out of Quebec, I think. In the same way when it's coming out of, like, Indigenous storytelling today, there was a long period of time in, like, the zeros and the tens where it was all French Canadian. So
where's bad cop, bond cop on this list?
nowhere to be found. That's where. And I say that as someone who actually likes that movie. It's not on the list,
like
and that is
movie.
Correct.
It is a fun movie.
Yeah, it is a fun movie.
I'm not sure if it still holds the record, but at one point it was Canada's highest grossing film, like Canadian made highest grossing film. So I don't know if that's changed or not. But that sort of leans into a little bit that I want to talk about. And let's talk about Canadian versus non-Canadian films. That's the last kind of point I want to get to. Matthew and Taylor, I know both of your lists kind of skewed more to Canadian produced for a different reason than maybe originally thought. And not just directly. I'm not trying to single you two out, but I think this leads us to an interesting angle where that means that movies like the number 26 entry, The Fly, one that is directed by a Canadian, shot in Toronto, and despite being a remake, kind of feels like a Canadian movie. Except that it's produced by 20th Century Fox, which makes it not a Canadian film. And then on the flip side, there are 3 films I want to single out that meet the criteria of being Canadian by virtue of where the money came from, but don't feature Canadian directors. You have 2016's Maudie, which was directed by Aisling Walsh, who's from Ireland. Room from 2015, directed by Lenny Abrahamson, who is also Irish. And then The Triplets of Belleville from 2003, directed by Sylvain Chomet, who is from France. Now, I didn't pick these 3 by random. I actually picked these 3 out specifically because they all won the Canadian Screen Award or Genie Award for Best Canadian Film for their years, despite having varying degrees of feeling quote-unquote Canadian. So I'd love to start with you, Matthew, on the topic of Canadian versus non-Canadian in terms of approaching this list and the list thesis of naming the best Canadian directed movies, not the best Canadian movies overall sort of thing. I know it's a bit of a wordy subject there, but I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that, Matthew.
Well, again, I just voted based on what I thought were the best Canadian specific films because I misread the instructions. So, I honestly, I don't know the answer. This is my answer. I don't know. I can't speak to how everyone would reconcile that because I obviously reconciled it one way. It sounds like Taylor reconciled it along similar lines. But I think the beauty of such a broad prompt is that you're going to get lots of different interpretations. So like, even though I was maybe technically wrong, was I though? And like, because it's so broad, was I? I'm maybe not. And you're going to get, we have 83 respondents. We probably have 83 different interpretations of what that means. And I think that is what makes the list so, what's the right word here? Talk-aboutable, discussable. Because it's obviously super subjective, right? Like because we have such a broad range of responses, it's produced a very interesting list, and we're going to be talking about it for ages, which I think is a good thing. Like anything that gets us talking about more Canadian film, I think is a good thing.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I guess my response to that question, Dakota, would be, that raise an interesting point, which is that, we could also focus on Canadian productions by non-Canadian directors. Like that's a thing we could focus on. And yeah, like this list in general kind of came off as, maybe this is the wrong word, but a little clunky to me because it splits that divide between, like let's focus on Canadian productions and then let's focus on the Canadian directors and what they've done abroad on the grand scale. So yeah, I mean, I think it came off a little awkwardly that way, and then in that this list could be interpreted in those different ways. But yeah, I mean, like it also raises interesting questions. Again, just repeat that. But like, yeah, films like Room, and sorry, what were the other ones that you mentioned, Dakota?
Maudie, Room, and The Triplets of Belleville.
Yeah, like those are all fine, really fine films, and where do they stand in line with all these other films that we've been talking about? I think they certainly deserve to be in kind of these discussions, but this list has kind of decided to go this kind of very I don't know, like a route that like really emphasizes Canadian talent and kind of what it's done on a broader scale and how it's kind of expanded beyond just the somewhat limiting confines of what can be considered Canadian film. Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of rambling, but that's my response to that question. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Rachel, do you have any sort of thoughts on that? I know it's a very silly thing that I brought up.
No, it's not at all. I think like I sound like a shill for CBC here, but it's like I think one of the reasons that they went this route is because there are so many lists out there of the best Canadian, especially because this was timed for Canada Day, right? So around that time, every film outlet is basically thinking, all right, let's pull together a list of the best Canadian movies, and it's hard to be unique and offer something a little bit different when there's only so many movies that you can go around. So you could be like the best Canadian horror movies, the best Canadian whatever movies. Like, so I kind of appreciate that they took a different route with this and saying like very specifically, let's look at Canadian directors. It doesn't matter if it's a Canadian movie or not. We just want to celebrate Canadian directors very specifically, where a lot of other outlets are doing, let's celebrate Canadian film industry as a whole, which is a much more broad, but those lists tend to come down, I would say, in a very, not similar to this list, but like those lists can be very similar. Like the films that get selected are more or less the same films year after year. And I can only imagine that CBC every single year is trying to like clawing at the walls, trying to figure out something new to put out at Canada Day, specifically CBC Arts when it comes to like movies, because what else can they really do? And so in that sense, like I see where they're going with this list and why it sounds, I think, you know, Taylor, you mentioned it's like clunky. I think the clunky thing is like the name of the list, because it's a lot of words versus just saying 50 greatest Canadian movies. That's very simple and it's very point blank, but something like, I don't know what the exact, is it 50 greatest, the 50 greatest films directed by Canadians. It's just a lot. It's a lot to say. And you kind of have to think about like, what the hell are they talking about? So, but I do appreciate what they were trying to do with this one. Yeah, because it's hard after a while, I think, after so many years when you just keep coming out with similar lists and then starting like the cycle back again in 5 years' time. Like, so.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Yeah, totally fair. Maybe next year they should do the 50 greatest like performances by Canadian actors or something.
That'd be cool. I'd be down for that. That'd be a really interesting one, actually. You should work for CBC, Matt.
Well, you're the only person I know who works at CBC, so maybe you can put in a word.
I do not work at CBC. I want to be very clear about that. I don't work at CBC. Every now and then I do something for them every now and then. But
occasionally for them. So I'm just saying.
For them, yes.
Put in a word for me. And
sure.
That'll be fine. Yeah.
So, Rachel, as the president of the CBC, with you organizing all this,
I was just going to say I have a question for Rachel because you're in the spotlight right now.
This is the question portion for me. Yes, continue.
Yeah. Is Crash your number one Cronenberg film?
No, funny enough, it's not. I love Crash. I think it's his. Oh, is it his best made movie? I don't know. I don't know if it's his best made movie. I love Crash a lot, though. I'm going to put that out there. I really do love Crash. My favorite Cronenberg movie, though, is Existence. I really enjoy it.
Okay.
I really like that movie, yeah.
I like that.
And Dead Ringers is up there for me as well. Same with Videodrome.
Yeah.
And what else? The Brood probably is up there.
Just name them all, Rachel. Come on.
I know. I do really love Cronenberg. But yeah, Crash isn't my favorite of his, but I do think it's probably his best made movie. Maybe all around, like if I think about like storytelling and filmmaking, put it all together, probably.
Yeah.
But The Fly, I think, actually is a contender for that. But yeah, Existence is my favorite.
I think it's and I'm saying this as a person who likes Existence. I think it's a hot take that that's your favorite of his films.
I just love it. I don't know why. There's something about that movie that I thoroughly enjoy. It's kind of like, it's like The Matrix. It's like The Matrix before The Matrix.
It's like The Matrix. It's like The Matrix, but also slightly gross.
It's very gross. It's a super soup. It's a soup. Like one thing with Cronenberg is he's got like an anus fascination. I think like so many of his little things, they look like anuses. There's that one, and then there's another movie. What's the
Everything
one?
in Naked Lunch. Is
Naked Lunch.
Yeah,
that's
what definitely anus is a Naked Lunch.
That is a very anus heavy movie, and I think Existence is kind of anus heavy, but not as anus heavy as Naked Lunch. Naked Lunch is very anus heavy.
Upsettingly, you're reminding me of the scene in Cosmopolis where Robert Pattinson is riding around in a limo and has a doctor join him, and he like inspects his anus.
He gets a prostate. He's getting
a prostate exam.
Yeah.
My favorite scene in that whole movie is that. I think Pattinson is so funny in that scene. But I'll also say Existence has Sarah Polley in it. She's an actor, and
that's right.
Honestly, I'm really glad Sarah Polley is making movies as a writer and director, but I do miss her as a performer.
She needs to come back.
She's so good.
Yeah, she's a good actress.
Yeah.
She's our Greta Gerwig, and I would take her above Greta Gerwig any day. Perfect. That's me.
Well, super quick question here. We're talking about in the next 20 years how this list might change. Who do you think is going to have more movies, Cronenberg or Villeneuve? Because Villeneuve, just his stock keeps on growing. How many more classic Cronenbergs are there going to be? I don't know. I still love the man, and I love Crimes of the Future. It almost made my list. Hot take there. But yeah, who's going to have more in the next, if they remake this list in 20, 25 years? Cronenberg or Villeneuve? Rachel? Because right now, Cronenberg has one more. Right now, it's 6-5.
Yeah, I would say Denis, I think. Because Denis is kind of in the place where Cronenberg was at back in the 90s, right?
30 years ago.
Yeah, and so Cronenberg, Denis has a lot ahead of him if he wants to. And I assume that he does, because he's got a ton of opportunity in front of him following the Dune series, especially. And I can only imagine that I don't know, I do like every single one of his movies. They're not all like hits and winners, but I would say I don't think he has a bad movie. Like, I don't think he's made a bad movie. And if he continues doing that, even for the next 15 years or even just next 10 years, then I kind of think it's him. Because I think Cronenberg, obviously he's slowed down because he's just getting older, and but I don't think we're going to have that many more movies from him.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then quickly, Matthew, what about you?
It's going to be Denis Villeneuve, but not because he's I don't think it's going to be because he's a better filmmaker. But I think that his films are, and this is going to sound bad, but it's not really meant to be like a bad thing, but his films are less challenging.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Right.
There's more mass appeal to
like,
at least his modern.
There's more mass appeal, which isn't
yeah.
a comment on the quality of the films. But what it does mean is that he's going to get a lot more opportunity from Hollywood to make bigger, more widely seen things. And I think that as a result, he will end up with more films on the list. But I would say that like trying to compare them is a fool's errand, because they're both great for different reasons.
Taylor, what about you? Are you on the same boat?
Yeah, I'm on the same boat. I'd echo everything that's been said thus far. While it would bring my heart great joy to see Cronenberg hold the title, I'm fully aware that Villeneuve he's got the power behind him. He's got all the momentum, really, and there's going to be more films out of him. He's going to get bigger budgets, and just like has been said, the mainstream appeal, the big studio, backing him and all that. He'll definitely make more of a lasting shockwave here, I guess, in the coming years, and I guess definitely between now and the next 20 years or whatever you said. But you got to wonder, like, will Villeneuve use his influence and the backing he can get now, and will he come back to Canada and make a more homespun production that's like maybe closer to something he's been, a personal project or something he's been sitting on or something? Will he do that and kind of affect Canadian cinemas that way? But who knows?
That's something Dakota and I talk about a lot, actually, is like we both want him to come home and do more stuff in Canada, but that's such a marked difference between the two directors as well, where Cronenberg really stayed in Canada. Cronenberg was very happy to stay here. He did obviously go to Hollywood for every now and then, but like I still consider him a fairly Canadian oriented director, whereas Denis, I think he's full on Hollywood at this point.
Yeah. I also think it's more interesting because I think Cronenberg does obviously do a little bit more stuff too. He also acts and performs in things.
Yeah.
And Villeneuve does not. And I will say, if I have to choose between having Cronenberg and Star Trek or Villeneuve in Star Trek. I'll take Cronenberg every time.
Oh yeah, man.
Watching Cronenberg and Last Night was easily one of the highlights of that.
Oh yeah, he's so good in that movie.
I just love everything.
His part is so, it's like small but pivotal and wonderful, and I love it.
I agree with it. What everyone is saying. I think Cronenberg is probably going to lose a movie. Probably going to lose Eastern Provinces. That's his lowest ranked one on here, and I think
I keep forgetting that's on there.
Probably going to gain a couple in that time frame. Yeah, it's really low. It's number 44. I voted for it, so I'm very happy to see it there. But I can easily see it falling down the list. But yeah, I think that's a great place for us to wrap up on. I feel like if we want to, we can go for another 2 hours and just keep nerding out on Canadian movies. And I don't think it's going to be the last time we talk about this subject as a whole. So, Taylor, thank you so much for coming on for the very first time. It was great having you, and it's definitely not going to be the last time. If you're interested in coming back, we'd love to have you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks again for having me. This was a lot of fun. I could talk your damn ears off about Canadian film. So thanks for having me.
Well, if people want to find more of your work or follow you, what's the best place to reach you? And do you have anything recent that you want to promote?
So admittedly, not too much recent on my writing, but I'm hoping to produce some more stuff for Real very soon. This is forreal.com. I'm at Best Real with 2 T's and REAL on Twitter and Instagram. Kind of, splitting my focus between outside of film these days, but still very much in the zone and ready to produce more stuff. So yeah.
Nice. Well, make sure to link to that in the show notes for people to find. And then Matthew, as always, thank you for coming back. Always appreciate you having you on. Where can people find you, and what have you got going on in your life right now?
So people can find me in a couple of places. The main place would be the Awesome Friday podcast, which you can search on basically any podcasting platform or go to awesomefriday.ca. I also write for a number of different places now, and you can just find all of my recent work at my personal website, which is stretched.ca. That's like I stretched it out.ca. Or on Twitter and Instagram and Threads now, because that's a thing, at SmatthewAF.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll make sure to link to all those in the show notes as well. And lastly, Rachel, what about you? Where can people find you, and what do you have going on right now?
As usual, it's the Twitter, Instagram _RachelKH, and all of my stuff is on rachelho.com. What's the newest thing? I guess it's going to be the Mission Impossible review. And I know I did a feature for Exclaim on, what did I do? It was like ranking the, or my favorite, it wasn't phrased as my favorite, but it is my favorite, stunts that the Mission Impossible series has done. Those both should be going up this week.
Can you spoil it and tell us that it was the Burj Khalifa was number one?
I can't. Okay, that was number 3.
I take your stammering as a yes, and we can just cut it there.
My personal favorite, I really love the Halo jump in Fallout. That's my favorite one. Like, I love that one. And then I love the one in, I think it's Rouge. I think it's that one.
Rouge Nation?
I can't remember. I'm trying to think of the one that he's hanging off the airplane. That one's really cool.
That's the beginning of
really love. Yeah, I love those ones. But officially the number 1 on that list was the one in the new one, the cliff jump that he does in Dead Reckoning.
Right. So you heard it here first. The Burj Khalifa is the best stunt. Excellent. Glad to hear it.
It is very cool, though, the Burj Khalifa one. Yeah.
This has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. You can follow this show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at contrazoompod. What did you think of the CBC list of the 50 greatest films directed by a Canadian? Let us know. Send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music, and to Stephanie Pry for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.